As a quick intro, my name is Colombe, and I'm the co-founder of Atlas. We do those events every couple of weeks with experts in different fields, mainly related to global governance and how we can better the world, to get expertise, obviously, on some key topics of our time. It's called Survival Sunday because we consider at Atlas that we are going through quite a few survival threats, from the climate crisis to pandemics and to freedoms being eroded. We consider this to be a very big threat to humanity. And we need to find ways to solve them. So we get their expertise, their opinion, and our policy team that is made of many, many incredibly smart people, then take those opinions to try to formulate policies we advocate for. It's also very useful to get general feedback and input from participants. During this call, we're going to be talking about, as it's clearly mentioned, the title freedoms. And that's because global freedom has been in decline for over 18 years, 18 consecutive years. To give you a quick idea, today, almost 40% of the world population lives in authoritarian countries. That's according to Freedom House, not me. And we think that, as I mentioned, is a huge survival threat. It impacts billions of people and indirectly all of us. And I'm sure you've heard the saying, a threat to justice somewhere is injustice everywhere, or it goes something along those lines. In French, it sounds a bit different. And we consider this to be the truth with freedoms as well. Right now, there's a big loss of trust in some global institutions we have that are tasked and have historically upheld freedoms, rights, and our peace and security, including the United Nations with current events. So we thought, who better to hear from than the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and on how to better protect freedom, on the state of freedom worldwide, of what we can all do. As I mentioned, for 45 minutes, we have the honor of having Gina Romero. We'll ask her everything you have on your mind and quite a few topics we prepared before, mainly along the lines of the state of freedom, how the UN functions to preserve, uphold, and defend them, how we can recreate and regain trust in certain institutions, and whether in a very polarized world, there's a way of upholding freedoms in a universal manner, or we have to pick and choose battles. This is it as a quick background. It's difficult to introduce Gina in just 2 minutes. She's done incredible things, but that's how I can do it. She's a Colombian activist who co-founded the Latin American and Caribbean Network for Democracy. I met her in that capacity a couple of years ago when she was also, I think, a point person for the Community of Democracies, which is, or your organization was a point person for the Community of Democracy, which is an intergovernmental organization for democracy. And in 2024, she became the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The last thing I wanted to mention is she just published, as part of her role, a report on the state of those freedoms across the world. And an element that I will want to jump on during this conversation is the fact that, Gina, you mentioned quite a bit that worldwide climate movements and pro-Palestinian or pro-solidarity with Palestinian people movements have been facing increased level of stigmatization, both online and offline. And there's been sweeping restrictions and repressions from state actors and non-state actors towards those movements, which is very relevant for us as a movement. Long introduction. I hope I didn't mess up your entire career, Gina. It's hard to summarize in a couple of lines. Thank you for being with us. My first question with you is, Special Rapporteur is a very cool title. Can you tell us what it actually means and how it helps preserve and uphold rights?
Yeah, thank you first to you, Colombe, to Andrea, just for the invitation and for all the people who's connecting now with very different time zones, and I'm really happy to be here. The first thing that I need to know is just to clarify that although special rapporteurs and special procedures are part of the UN system for protection and promotion of human rights, we are not UN. We are independent experts. And this is very difficult to understand, but then it's important because at the end we maintain some independence from the institution itself, but also from the different bodies that are related to the human rights system at the UN. So special rapporteurs mainly do three things. We collect information related to our mandate, including trends, challenges, good practices, allegations of human rights violations, etc. We process that information and we voice it up when needed. So we are appointed by the Human Rights Council to advise council members in the topic related to our mandate. So I have two rights in my head. I have the freedom of assembly and freedom of association. And then those are the topics that I collect information to, I process the information and voice up and establish a relation with different actors. So we collect information through meetings, events, consultations, visits, letters to governments, etc. With and on all these, it's like an open dialogue with different stakeholders, including government, civil society, and academia. And then we process this information. We create documents and reports, as the one that you just mentioned, that at some point come as a soft law in the international human rights law, and then includes 2 annual reports at least. And then if we do official visits, reports of the visits, we do statements, letters to governments, public and private. We are actually just part of amicus, of different processes, etc. And then we voice up whatever we think that is important to advance or protects the rights that are in our mandate, or the people who is in our mandate. And then that we do it like not only presenting these reports, but also just to engaging with the media and other actors. And then about the impact of the work, I think that many of the actions that the special rapporteurs do are actually using heavily around the globe from many different actors, including civil society and social movements, to be used as advocacy tools. Some of them actually include our letters and our reports in the legal processes. I've heard several cases in which lawyers, for example, use the information that we put either in our reports or in the specific letters that we send to the governments to actually just to make them part of their own legal strategy when they have processes open with the governments. And sometimes it actually helps victims. I've heard also that with some of the letters, some victims' families get information that government don't do to them about where are their whereabouts or about the legal charges that they don't receive and so on. And then a very important impact of the work that we do is about the public awareness, because at some point in many countries, the work that we do, the information that we provide and so on is used actually by the media, and then also just in making aware the people and the citizens about the situation of human rights in the countries. And then also, well, you have seen the fantastic work that several special rapporteurs, and including the rapporteur of the occupied Palestinian territory, has done in this past year, and so all these reports on not only the specific situation on Palestine, but also the famine, also all these housing issues, all these grave human rights violations that are happening in Gaza. All that information that has been collected and voiced from different special rapporteurs also are helping to do this public awareness of what is happening in the in situ. And that is only one specific because of the context that we have now. But I think that mainly those are the impacts that I can see and I can bring to the people who's listening today.
It's very interesting because you both have, in a way, the brands of the United Nations that gives you the legitimacy that comes with it and the recognition, while being able to be fully independent, as you mentioned. I don't know if people are aware, but special rapporteurs, as you told me once, are not paid by the United Nations. You are literally completely independent in the worst and best of ways. If I understand correctly, it's both you managed to raise awareness about certain topics, and you mentioned, for example, Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese and her work on the occupied territories. You also act as, I assume, kind of a legal expert on some cases, because certainly what you write, it's independent, you're an expert on it, people can take it up. And I followed certain of your cases, and we talked about some of the cases you took up and communications you brought forward. When you talk about an activist that has been detained because of, for example, they partook in a protest or organized a meeting that the government didn't like, when you do that, suddenly the case becomes more important in the eyes of the public in a certain way. And some governments don't necessarily want that attention. from the outside world. So I know that your work is actually extremely impactful. You help get people out on bail and out of prison. You help literally with their very survival, which is quite amazing to see just from having independence and yet also branding of the United Nations. And I see a few questions that I'm going to add, everyone, but I wanted to link this to, you mentioned other special rapporteurs, and recently it's linked to the loss of trust in the UN, I think. We've seen, for example, Special Rapporteur Albanese being attacked for a lack of objectivity. And I'm putting this in quotes because I actually don't believe this whatsoever. But we've seen her being subject to systemic attacks by certain groups and so on that are trying to delegitimize her. Some governments have also accused her of being anti-Semitic and so on. And I assume other special rapporteurs are going through similar attacks when they take on big powers, and etc. Do you think that your role, not just you personally, but the role of special rapporteurs, the role of, and more widely, the role of the UN and of UN processes is as respected as it used to be? Do you feel like it's under attack? Or do you feel maybe that people trust it less because of certain failures of the United Nations, even if you are not obviously, part of the United Nations, but of the United Nations in addressing crisis across the world?
I think that there are like two different layers there. So yeah, we get a lot this message that we lack of objectivity, and that is very tricky because governments sometimes say that we lack of objectivity because we don't sit with them or we don't receive official information. But then when we ask governments to send us official information, when we ask them questions and send them letters like requesting information and analysis, when we ask for official visits, they refuse and they don't reply the questions. So it is very weird that they keep saying that we lack of objectivity because we don't have like the voice of the government, but then never open up, or they send information that is like hardly difficult to understand, that is true. So that we have a lot, and then and several special rapporteurs have been attacked, not as much as Francesca, but then I see that mainly country mandates have been attacked heavily by actually the governments on the countries that they have the mandate, and then at some point I think that all this idea of lack of trust of the UN is true in general, but it has very different layers, because at some point, although the UN it's in a big crisis of trust, is still an organization that many people care, like many people listen. And then therefore that falls also on us. Some people say, oh, you are the UN and you don't do anything. But then at the end, they do talk about the things that we talk. They do actually discuss the information that you put out there. So it's just like, it's very difficult because the trust and the distrust go like in the same way. And then it's a very complex phenomena. But then for sure, when governments attack the special procedures, the special rapporteurs and independent experts and the working groups, they are actually attacking at the same time the legitimacy of the UN and the legitimacy of our own work. Yeah. And that goes in an intersection like every day. Some attacks are harder and then more violent, and some others are just governments sending us letters saying that we lack of objectivity, which is sometimes very weird when they say so, because they don't talk to us.
I know, but you don't want to listen, but then you refuse to speak. Kind of like in a bad breakup, one accuses someone of refusing to listen, and the other one just ghosts the person. It doesn't make much sense. Okay. It's very interesting because when we speak about UN processes, most people are kind of disconnect, right? It's like, oh, it's too difficult, I don't care, and so on. But at the same time, the reason for which we're having this discussion is we both fundamentally believe that the United Nations is an incredible project. I mean, it's literally insane that it still stands in a way, considering how messed up the world is right now. And to have a space, I remember during the UN General Assembly, I went to the General Assembly Hall, and amidst the Summit of the Future, that I was personally very disappointed with the outcome and the lack of ambition, and I was feeling a bit down, and I went to the General Assembly Hall and I felt chills all over my arms. I was like, it's incredible to see so many countries, despite a lot of them actually being at war and in conflict, sitting together, and while some walk out during some of the speeches, still having to listen to one another, right?
Yeah.
And then you see Zelensky addressing the General Assembly, and then you see the Palestinian delegation doing the same, and you see all of this, and it's a movement that is extremely strong, that I think shows the potential that the UN has in, and I mean potential that it's failing on certain conflicts, in maintaining peace and security. And it reminds us of the incredible achievement it had from, diminishing the amount of nuclear arsenal to eliminating polio for a while, and so on and so forth. So its potential is insane, but people have lost, I think, faith in the political angle that comes with the United Nations. And I'm going to take the first question from social media here, which is linked to COP29. So considering your role working on freedom of association, for those who don't know, COP29 is the climate conference that is held every year, which is supposed to basically keep us alive at the end of the day. I'm simplifying it by having countries make commitments on how we're not going to die because of climate change. Again, I'm oversimplifying it. Theoretically, this year they talk about finance. COP29 is held, or COP is held in different countries, and this year it's held in Azerbaijan, which is ranked by Freedom House. I think freedoms are 7 out of 100, so it's pretty bad. A lot of the opposition and journalists have been imprisoned. Over 300 people have been imprisoned ahead of COP. And I was there last week. You are not allowed to wear the slightest political symbol to conduct any protest or anything. So it goes completely against the freedom that you tackle, talk about, uphold. What do you think? So the question specifically is, what's your take on the situation? Do you think the UN should host international conferences in such places when freedoms are not guaranteed? With the obvious, I'll add the point of it, the pro that, those countries are petrostates and we need them to transition away, but at the same time, we can't associate or protest.
Yeah, I think that this is something that is very problematic and is very tricky, because then at the end, every year, and not only this type of COP or other conference of state parties from different treaties provided a thought reminder that it's insufficient the progress that it has been made, in this case in the adoption of the Paris Agreement, but in others. And then the action of civil society, of social movements or protest even, it's very important to influence the call of bolder and broader actions and deep and just to call and create some sensitivity about the deep impact of the failure. But then with the election of countries with heavy general restrictions to the right of protest, for example, such as Azerbaijan, the possibility of an impact of these voices that are not heard because of the design of the whole process, it's very limited. And then while Azerbaijan has been preparing to host the COP, in recent months, they have been marked by alarming wave of arrests and the setting of criminal cases against human rights defenders in the country, including journalists and independent media. And then I was seeing yesterday like a release, some information that the Mitchell Forrest, who is there, which is actually the rapporteur for the environmental defenders, was saying that he felt that the a sense of surveillance, a sense of that is not freedom actually in the place, although it can looks like that. So while COPs should be an exemplary UN-led model for the safe participation for example, environmental defenders, each year the challenges for this participation is higher. Civil society participation at the COPs, you have seen, has been repeatedly hindered, but then when the places they use as a host countries, when they choose host countries that are even the worst countries for the rights of, name it, freedom of assembly and association, for freedom of expression, is just like a general, it actually obstructs the possibility for defenders, but also for special rapporteurs and other actors to actually do the work what we do. And this is very problematic. This is actually something that needs to be taken into account, because then we need to stop having these conferences in places in which their freedoms are heavily restricted, because then they send like a very mixed message. It's like, yeah, we are going to advance in this type of rights, but then we are going to advance in this right without guaranteeing other rights. And this completely violates the universality of rights, and it's just very, very problematic. And right now, Azerbaijan has had a tool on the restrictions on participation, on voicing, on protest, and you name it, other rights that are very important to actually face as you mentioned, the survival challenge that we have in regards the damage of the planet.
Yeah, and I think it also delegitimizes a bit the process, right? Or the outcome in a way. Besides, obviously, it's wrong. I mean, there's no other way of putting it, right? Like, if you imprison all of your opposition and journalists, how on earth can you trust the outcome? It's insane. But second, I've been to a couple of COPs, and I've been to Glasgow and this one. I've never seen any UN spaces when you enter them as someone who's not from a UN circle is you don't understand how even when civil society is welcome, super hard to participate. You need an enormous amount of money, time, expertise on it. You're not welcome anyhow into negotiation rooms. So it's never fully open, right? And obviously it can't be open to 50,000 people at the same time. So some restrictions are understandable. But a concrete example is while there, we received emails from UNFCFF, so from the COP administration, explaining that you cannot wear any political symbol, that you cannot organize any activist action when heads of state are present, that you cannot organize anything after with more than 15 people and without approval from the authorities. I mean, this is on UN, theoretically, on UN ground, right? Like during a UN conference. How are people supposed to trust anything coming out of this when you are told you cannot do your job? I mean, for civil society organizations, I'm putting it together in the most simple manner. But the general thing is, we're not states. We're here to hold people accountable. And a part of it is making a mess. A part of it is saying what they don't want us to say in the first place. Literally. But
the problem is that the UN has several design problems, the B2 problem is one of the biggest, but then in general, these international institutions that say that they are designed to bring together states and nations actually are venues only for governments. And there is a huge difference of being a venue for a nation and a state and a venue for a government. Because at the end, governments are politicians, some of them are bureaucrats. They are elected as a representation of the people, but they are not the people. Yep. And in multilateral institutions, if multilateral institutions for real want to bring the state and the nations, they need to bring its people. And the easiest is to bring openly, widely, and to include in the whole process of decision making civil society and social movements and others. But then we don't have international organizations. We have intergovernmental organizations. It is the difference. And this is why they don't like civil society. They don't like the voice of the actors. They do like some voices that have more power, like, for example, some companies, especially in these environmental issues. But then there is not the voice of the people. And this is the main, for me, this is the main design problem from all these institutions, not only the UN.
I agree. I think something very clear. People often, when you criticize the lack of participation, say, well, new government is there, and some of us elect our governments. And we tend to forget another element, I think, which is our governments represent national interests, right? They're elected on the national agenda from a national electorate to protect the national interest. The United Nations is supposed to protect and represent a global interest. So how can you have a global interest represented if, let's say, I was the president of X country, and my main worry is being re-elected in X country because I represent X citizens and not the common good. So how is that possible? I want to leave room to live questions as well, but everyone please write them down. I'm going to try to summarize a few questions together. You can take it however you want, Gina. I see from social media questions linked to the US administration, whether this is going to lead to freedom of association and freedom of assembly diminishing across the world. I want to link this to the fact, as I mentioned, freedoms in general have been in decline for 18 consecutive years. How do we ensure that it doesn't make it to 20, right? How do we ensure that we change the tide? How do we ensure that freedoms are actually upheld, more than this, expanded, and that we have full access to them, wherever we are, etc.? And linked to this, you mentioned universalism. You mentioned the fact that, some values are universal, but in certain conferences and certain settings that you said, we choose to uphold some more than others, right? Like you just mentioned at COP, we choose to focus more on climate rights in a way than on political and civic rights. Something I've noticed, and I'm going to tell you a super quick anecdote, is I think we are starting as well across the world to focus more on who we like versus who we don't like, and are more willing to accept violations of rights from certain actors. You talked about Palestine, so I'm going to jump on this on the Taliban, right? Like when people, I stand with Palestinian people, I'm pro-Palestine, I believe the occupation needs to end, all of this. As a result, I believe the US is in the wrong because the US is providing weapons, fuel, etc. to Palestine. Same with European countries. That can be true for me, while at the same time understanding that Russia is waging an invasion on Ukraine and is violating people's rights. Yet, often, like I went to a protest 2 weeks ago and I had both a Ukrainian and a Palestinian flag, and people would attack one or the other because they were either pro-US or pro-Russia, not because they actually cared a lot of the times about the people on the ground being murdered. A quick other example is at COP this time around, I saw really randomly the Taliban passed 5 meters in front of me. The Taliban representation. Something very weird to see in general at a COP, especially since the Taliban is not the representative. I think the UN still hasn't accepted the Taliban as a legitimate government. I posted about it on social media, and actually posting the demands of Afghan women civil society organization, which is include women in talks, etc. Not even saying like they shouldn't be here. For me, they shouldn't be here. It's weird, but saying women need to be included, aid need to reach those most in need, etc. And directly, I got responses that I thought I would never see in my entire life, which was, the US is worse. Who cares? The US is supporting genocide. Who cares? And it kind of struck, honestly, it made me very sad because I was like, yes, the US is supporting genocide and needs to be held accountable to it. The Taliban's breaching every single rights of women and girls and should be held accountable to it. Both can be true at the same time. So my question is, we see this in terms of certain rights that tend to have more value in the eyes of people, whether it's linked to climate or freedoms. We also see this in terms of blocks. We tend to accept that certain people might commit more violations because they're on our side, on the right side. Is it something you're also witnessing? Do you see the universality of rights declining? And do you have suggestions on how to tackle what I think is absolutely insane and an alternate reality and a matrix that is very, very scary in general?
Yeah, it's very difficult and it's very tricky because there are several layers of complexity when you do an analysis of values. So in one layer, values and rights and freedoms. So in one layer, people do value their rights. The problem is that most of them take them from granted, or they don't understand that something is a right. And perhaps in a branch of that layer, many people do not even understand the impact of their actions in others. So in a world with this huge individualism, it's normal not to see the other or see it with distrust or see it as a danger, and anything that could challenge my comfortable reality, it's seen as a danger. So in other layer, people is actually terrified of many dangers that are out there. You mentioned several, but there are like so many. And then this is why this is a situation that creates blocks and then kind of fans. I'm just like more inclined to this. So I create like a close block related to this. And then the problem is that although some of these problems and dangers are actually real, like the survival in this planet is real, some others are not that real or are distorted or are a tool of manipulation for different actors. Therefore, misinformation, disinformation plays a huge role in identifying and trying to make the people to put like just to do a prioritization on rights and values, and that is just like such so problematic. As when we were talking, there is not this UN as a black fixed unified box. There is not such a thing as the people. So there are several complex of interest and Yeah, and just fears that the people has, and all these layers happen at the same time. And we humans in reality are very simple. We choose what is easiest and closest to our emotions. And in a world that is completely seated in fear and hate, it's actually natural, which is very sad, but it's natural for people to choose to live in a war zone between freedom and, for example, security, or between rights and, for example, the fear of the other. And the other can be the migrant, the other can be the Black, the other can be the indigenous, the other can be the person who go to the street, the other is anybody. And then regarding the rights that I have in my mandate, I see this constant debate, which in some cases is like vague. It has not a real sustain, and I see it every day. So the apparent conflict between the freedom of association, but also this war of the end of on NGOs that several governments have because they don't like the dissent. So the problem is not that the NGO, the problem is that we are having governments that hate to be challenged by anyone. Example, for example, we have the freedom of assembly, but then the freedom of assembly for some of them, and not against my right to be in time of a meeting, or not against the idea that I have, for example, of sexual and reproductive rights, no against the ideas that I have on religion and women's right. And this is very problematic because at the end is as if rights and as if freedoms were only for a petite group, that is my group. But then the other groups, they cannot have those rights. And then we have, I thought, like, when you see the evolution of human rights, this is a problem that we thought we had passed several years ago, and then it's still there as a problem. And then I'm very happy that you put on the example about the blogs of Ukraine and Palestine, because the problem is that as we are like working our minds and hearts and our life, the humanity life and the social sphere is so rooted in like groups, and sometimes very deeply identified groups. We forget to connect to each other, and then all these the real problems that we have in the world are problems that are affecting humanity. It's not a flag, it's not a land, it's actually we as humans being killed, we as humans living like no dignified lives, we as humans being also part of a system that is actually like fueling wars and genocide. And these are the discussions that we need to have. But then we are not having them because we are living in a place in which, because of social media, because we don't have the ability to talk to others, because we live in a bubble on reinsurance, which is my identity, and not challenging ourselves, we lost the opportunity. And then it's terrible because that is going to be creating more conflict and more wars and more reactions against rights and freedoms, which should be universal and applied with no discrimination. And that is very problematic. We are losing, and then the importance that I see of the rights that I have in my mandate, which is the association and assembly, is that those are two of the rights with freedom of expression that actually make us talk to others, make us come together and trying to identify, okay, this is good or this is not good. Why are we saying that the rights of these people are better than the rights that we have? Or why is this confrontational view on rights? And this is something that we are not being able, because then civil society is being persecuted, protests are being very heavily repressed or forbidden. So it's just like a very complex situation in which we are not doing better if we don't connect again with ourselves in as humans, and not as part of an identity or an ideology which is actually fueling more hate.
Yeah, I like the way you put it around blocks. It's very true. It's we identify, and I guess it's kind of human nature in a way, with those close to us or something like this. I think a feeling I got lately on looking at comments on TikTok and so on is sometimes it feels like our hate or dislike of certain powers is more important than the cause you're actually talking about. which for me is very, very worrying because again, like we're talking, again, I mentioned Ukraine and Palestine. I could mention the Taliban. I could mention any rights. And I think it's very linked to association, as you said, for example. And you care about what is happening down the line, not because of a flag. I agree with you. I fundamentally don't care about a flag. Like that's personal, but I don't care a single second. I care about what is happening because human lives are being taken, because rights are being infringed. Yet, the responses I see and the violence of the responses I see often is more targeted not at what is happening on the ground, not at the people that are on the receiving ends of such actual real attacks, but more linked to, well, I really dislike this power. You know, like I'm very anti-US. So by nature, I'm pro-Russia. Or you know, like it's not it's I see this quite a bit. Or like, well, I stand with Ukraine. So by nature, not pro-Palestine. Which I get what you say about the blocks and I understand it. And in another way, I also think the complexity of the system in which we live, which suddenly, if you start looking at rights, right, and including freedom of association, and you start looking at what countries are doing, at first you're like, okay, so I know this country is bad. This is clear. This country, like we just talked about Azerbaijan, you don't have a freedom of protest. This I know. In my mind, it's clear. There's a bad guy here. But then suddenly you start looking at others. And for example, the US, and in your reports you mentioned on Columbia University campus, if I'm not mistaken, and in other places in the US, freedom of association, freedom of protest being restricted, being stigmatized with, and I actually want to ask you a question before we close on this as well. And you're like, oh my God, actually in the US as well, the US is also a bad guy. But wait, if Azerbaijan, the US, Afghanistan, and then suddenly most powers are doing wrong, what do I trust in? What do I have faith in? How do I go forward? I think it also kind of distorts people's sense of reality and of who they should look to for safety, for security, for hope, for a future. If you start looking at it in a systematic manner, which is what we should be doing, obviously, and start looking at rights in a systematic manner, because you realize that very few countries are doing right by those rights. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a bit about the reports that you just linked and will link in our social media that you just published. But second, and what are your main findings when it comes to climate and Palestine, and how to actually address the stigmatization and repression of those freedoms? But second, do you look to certain countries, certain groups, certain institutions with hope? Do you see a way out of this dichotomy of you stand with one block, you stand for one right, you stand for whatever? Is there anything that could, not necessarily that we should look to with blind hope, but that shows us a way of how to overcome this hyperpolarization, this hyper divide in the world? Please give us hope, basically, on a Sunday.
Yeah. Just two things in my mind. One is that I don't, with very exceptional cases, that unfortunately every time are less exceptional. There is not one big evil. I mean, there is not one. There's not you say, oh, the US is terrible, or oh, Europe is terrible. But then at the end, at the same time, these countries are also doing a great good in several other issues. So it is we live in this very complex world in which a single entity can be very evil for one thing and can be very good to other. And then how can you analyze this? It's something that is very important for us to see. Let's put it in the terms of the UN. So the UN has this very bad reputation now. No, the UN is not doing anything to curtail Gaza's genocide. The UN is not doing anything in you naming so many other things. But then when you go to the field and you talk to people that somehow is being close to the UN action in the field because they are close to national office, or they are close to a regional office, or they are close to some peacekeeping actions and so on, you see that sometimes the information that you receive is completely different. And then it's very weird to see how can we also, I mean, for example, no doubt Gaza is testing the system, and so far the system is failing in the time of Gaza. But we still see that the UN, as many other actors, are not a monolithic, and then in different levels has its goods and bads, and some places more goods and some places more bads, because that is how reality works. But then again, still the idea of having a global institution that have the then, as you were mentioning, the nearly impossible task to convene and set a venue for dialogue and for decision making among governments is like more relevant than ever. And the same, when you see that some governments are attacking, for example, Francesca from one side, but from the other side, they are doing so much actions regarding several other issues that are relevant. For example, the discussions for the rights of minority groups, or the rights for women, or the rights for indigenous peoples. You say, okay, how the hell can we get these people to do best in all the cases and not in others, and not in only ones? And that is problematic. What I think in reality is that we need citizens more aware of the impact of their countries in the international sphere, and to make better decisions in the local level. Because that is the problem, that when you see this, as I was mentioning before, when we see these institutions that are composed by governments, not by the complexity of the state actors, then you'll see that at some point, these governments are always going to be taking the lead on the politics that they have in their minds. And then if civil society, if citizens, if media, if many other actors are not being able to challenge that, internally, but not even externally in international sphere, because as we mentioned, the participation of these different spaces are like curtailed or is not impactful. Then at the end, the problem is that these people do whatever they need to, whatever they want to, without actually, regardless of what you were saying, it's like the will of the people. And the people's, not only the people who elect them. So I think that we need to actually be more present as citizens to actually move our governments in a better way, or actually being for us in the political and citizen way, just to actually punish them when they don't do what they need to do. But then on some other place, some other context, and I end this with what you started the question. It's about what happened with changes, when political changes are actually more likely to undermine the possibility of the public discourse to be more keen in the respect of human rights, and it's about the election of Trump. And then at the end, it's very tricky, because the U.S. has been an ally for example, the freedom of assembly worldwide for so many years. And at the same time, the government that we have now, it's one of the governments that it has been closely complicit with what has been happening in Gaza. And those things had happened at the same time. But then now the problem is that perhaps we are losing with the new government, we are losing this champion of several other things that have been very relevant. And in this case, that is actually very problematic, because we are going to have a block, if we put it again in the terms of blocks, that actually is going to be blocking even the system. And this is what I think that is problematic. But at the end, I think that we are having other governments that are doing well, as you mentioned, and then perhaps those governments can also push for like a call, a pure accountability between governments and state actors that are actually trying to promote more rights and freedoms. And then what I keep saying, it's that we in humanity have lived so many bad things. But then at the end, the resilience of civil society, the capacity and the courage of so many movements have been present in all the history, that I'm sure that here is going to spark more creativity ways for actually go against the powers that don't want people to exercise their rights. And this is just a new battle of many that we have had. And then I think that we need to start, Colombe, to also honor and celebrate, as international community and civil society and social movements and others, the successes that we have, even if they are little, because then we are living now in a very gloom world. And then we have been having successes. They could be little, they could actually be erased very easily, and then things change very easily. But then at some point, I think that this type of crisis, what creates is more resilience. It creates more, it is inspire more creativity. It inspires the creation of new movements, of more movements. And then I am very, although and I put it in the chat, the link of the statement that I did on the pro-Palestine movement that has been happening in the pro-Palestine solidarity movement that has been happening in the universities worldwide. And then that movement gives me so much energy and hope, because at the end we are having a horrible situation in many places. But then Gaza is actually bringing us again to the discussion of humanity. It is bringing us back again. This is a problem of people that is being, this is a genocide. This is something that cannot be happening in our front, in our eyes. And then there is this youth that are taking universities, that are taking streets, that are challenging their powers, the smaller power that they have in front, that is the university, and then with what that comes with that in terms of the political power. And I think that sparks and gives me more hope, even if the movement is being repressed, and is being repressed because it is important, because it's powerful, because it's creating changes. And I think that this is the way that we need to do. If we need to defend rights and freedoms, we need to have more people being involved in this, and more people just to stop being complicit, or stop just turning the head away of the bad things that the governments are doing. But then we need radical imagination. We need to start thinking in other ways of doing the things that we have been doing, thinking in other ways of actually react and actually curtail the restriction of rights. And then there are several actors that are like going there, and it's very beautiful to see it, although it's painful to see how difficult and how slow it is. But then in terms of ending with a hope note, I think we have a lot of power. Citizens have power, movements have power, and then that is the power in which the changes will rely, even if governments and other powerful actors don't want us and them. There is still going to be there, and then resistance is always going to be a way of doing it.
It's a perfect ending, and I completely agree. I know you have to go, but thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it. We'll share the recording, and we're so thankful for your time. Good luck with your 2,000 travels, and continue to live and not survive.
Thank you to you all. Thank you. Goodbye. Have a nice end of the day for you.